Did you know that for medieval women, becoming a nun was sometimes less about a spiritual calling and more about survival, power, or even escaping a terrible fate? What if the quiet walls of a convent offered freedoms a woman might never find outside? Let's dive into the fascinating and often surprising world of medieval nuns, specifically between the 10th and 15th centuries. Number 5. Personal autonomy and escape from marriage. Imagine a world where your future, your property, and even your body were not your own. For many women in the medieval period, life outside the convent walls meant a constant battle for control, often lost before it even began. Marriage was the expected path, a foundational pillar of society. But this institution, while offering security for some, often meant a complete surrender of personal will and independence for women. A woman became legally subject to her husband upon marriage, losing her own name, her legal standing, and control over any property she might have brought into the union. Her dowry, though hers in name, was managed by her husband, and her daily life was dictated by his household. Children, too, were his. For many, this prospect was less a joyous union and more a life sentence of subordination. This is where the convent offered a radical, almost subversive alternative. It was a place where a woman could potentially avoid the predetermined path of marriage entirely. Instead of being given to a husband, she was given to God, a transaction that paradoxically could grant her a level of personal autonomy unheard of for a laywoman. Inside the convent, a woman was not subject to a male head of household in the same way a wife was. She was part of a community of women, governed by a female superior, the abbess, who was often elected by her peers. This internal governance structure meant that decisions affecting her daily life, her spiritual pursuits, and her intellectual development were made within a female-centric framework, a stark contrast to the patriarchal world outside. Consider the opportunities that opened up. A nun retained her own identity within the monastic community. She was part of a corporate body, a legal entity that owned property, managed finances, and engaged with the outside world. If she rose to the position of abbess, her autonomy expanded exponentially. An abbess was a powerful figure, not just spiritually, but economically and politically. She managed vast estates, sometimes larger and wealthier than those of many minor lords. She oversaw agricultural production, collected rents, managed tenants, and engaged in trade. She employed numerous people, both lay and religious, and her decisions directly impacted their lives and livelihoods. Take, for example, the abbesses of Gandersheim in Saxony, a renowned imperial abbey established in the 9th century. These women were not just spiritual leaders. They were powerful feudal lords, wielding significant political influence in the Holy Roman Empire. They commanded armies, presided over their own courts of justice, and even minted their own coins. They swore fealty directly to the emperor, bypassing male bishops or counts. For a woman, becoming an abbess of Gandersheim meant ascending to a position of power that a laywoman, even a queen, rarely achieved. She was not a wife or a mother in the conventional sense, but a ruler in her own right, her autonomy enshrined by legal and ecclesiastical tradition. Heratzbitha of Gandersheim, a nun there in the 10th century, stands as a testament to the intellectual freedom this environment fostered. She wrote plays, poems, and historical chronicles, making her one of the earliest known female playwrights in European history, a pursuit almost unimaginable for a married woman tied to household duties. Similarly, the abbesses of Quedlinburg, another imperial abbey, held immense power and prestige. These abbesses were often from the highest noble families, including royal dynasties. They governed a sprawling territory, exercised significant judicial rights, and participated in imperial diets, political assemblies of the Holy Roman Empire. Their independence was such that they often resisted attempts by male bishops to assert authority over their convents, fiercely protecting their autonomy and the unique status of their institutions. For a noble family, placing a daughter in Quedlinburg was not a sacrifice but a strategic move, securing a powerful ally and a representative within the highest echelons of power. For the daughter herself, it was an escape from a potentially stifling or politically disadvantageous marriage, offering a life of influence and independence that no ordinary marriage could provide. Convent also offered a different kind of personal space, a private sphere often denied to women in the lay world. In a medieval household, privacy was a luxury, especially for women. Convent, with its individual cells or shared dormitories, its cloisters for contemplative walks, and its structured daily routines, provided a degree of personal space and quiet that allowed for introspection, study, and the cultivation of one's own thoughts and interests. This was particularly appealing to women who might have preferred intellectual pursuits over domestic management or courtly life. The very act of choosing the convent, even if initially influenced by family, represented a choice for a distinct way of life, one that could be shaped by the individual woman's aspirations for self-determination. In a society where female agency was often constrained, the convent walls paradoxically could become a boundary that defined not limitation, but liberation. It allowed women to escape the expected roles of wife and mother, roles that often meant subservience and a lack of individual standing, and instead embrace a life where they could lead, learn, and govern, forging their own paths within a respected and powerful institution. This alternative offered not just spiritual solace, but a tangible pathway to a life of greater personal autonomy and influence than the outside world often permitted. Number 4. Economic necessity and lack of alternatives. For many women in medieval Europe, the decision to enter a convent was not primarily driven by a deep spiritual calling, but by the harsh realities of economic survival. In a society where a woman's economic security was almost entirely dependent on her marital status or her family's wealth, the convent offered a dignified and often the only viable alternative for those facing limited options. Life outside the convent could be precarious, especially for women without a dowry, a husband, or a supportive family. The dowry system was central to medieval marriage. It was a sum of money, goods, or property that a bride brought to her husband upon marriage, intended to provide for her upkeep during the marriage and ensure her financial security in widowhood. For many families, providing a substantial dowry for multiple daughters was a monumental economic burden. If a family had several daughters, or if their fortunes declined, they might simply not have enough resources to provide adequate dowries for all of them. A daughter without a dowry was virtually unmarriageable, her prospects bleak, and her future uncertain. She might become a permanent burden on her family, dependent on the charity of relatives, or face the grim reality of poverty, potentially forced into arduous domestic service, with little security or dignity, or even prostitution as a last resort. The convent provided a solution to this profound economic dilemma. While convents also required a dowry or entrance fee, sometimes called a portion or karadi, this payment was often significantly less than what was required for a marriage. It was a one-time contribution that secured a woman's place for life, providing her with food, shelter, clothing, and a respectable social standing within the monastic community. For families unable to afford a grand marriage dowry, the convent presented a far more affordable and honorable option for their daughters. It ensured their daughters would be cared for, educated, and maintain a respected place in society, rather than being left destitute or socially marginalized. Records from various convents across Europe hint at this pragmatic arrangement. Families of lesser nobility or wealthy merchants, who might struggle to marry off all their daughters advantageously, frequently placed one or more in convents. These were not always the most pious daughters. Sometimes they were simply the surplus daughters, those for whom a suitable marriage match could not be found or afforded. For these women, the convent offered a secure and respectable livelihood, a stark contrast to the insecurity and potential shame of remaining unmarried and unprovided for in the secular world. Consider the plight of widows. While some widows inherited their husband's property and could maintain a comfortable life, many found themselves in vulnerable positions. They might be dispossessed of their property, forced into unwelcome remarriages, or left with insufficient means to support themselves and their children. For such women, especially those past childbearing age, or those who simply desired a life of quiet dignity, the convent offered a refuge, provided a stable community, spiritual solace and economic security without the pressures and dangers of the outside world. A widow entering a convent often brought a portion of her dower or her remaining property, which secured her place and sometimes even increased the convent's holdings. The growth of beguinages, communities of laywomen living together semi-religiously without formal vows, particularly in the Low Countries, also points to this economic imperative. These communities, while not strictly convents, offered similar benefits: communal living, shared resources, and a respected social identity for women who could not marry or preferred to live independently. Many women who joined beguinages were widows or unmarried women of modest means who sought mutual support and a structured way of life that was economically sustainable. They engaged in crafts, charitable work, and prayers, living a dignified life outside the conventional marriage system, often for reasons of economic necessity as much as religious devotion. Furthermore, for women from urban artisan or merchant families, the convent could offer a respectable alternative to a marriage into a lower social class or a life of unremitting labor. If a family's business faltered, or if a daughter showed no aptitude for the necessary skills to contribute to the family trade, the convent provided a ready-made support system. It was a way for families to ensure their daughters maintained a certain social standing, even if they couldn't afford a prestigious marriage. The skills learned within the convent walls, literacy, administration, needlework, herbal medicine, could also provide a measure of self-sufficiency and contribution to the monastic community, offering a sense of purpose and belonging. In times of widespread poverty, famine, or disease, the convent also functioned as a form of social welfare, providing a structured environment where basic needs were met. While not open to all, for those who could gain entry, it provided stable meals, shelter, and a community, which might have been scarce commodities in the outside world. This economic security, coupled with the social respectability afforded to nuns, made the convent an undeniably attractive option for women facing economic hardship or lacking alternative means of support in the challenging medieval landscape. For countless women, the convent was not merely a spiritual haven, but a practical, economic necessity, offering a dignified existence in a world often unforgiving to those without means. Number 3, safety, security, and refuge from the world. Medieval Europe was a tumultuous and often dangerous place. Wars, feuds, famine, plague, and political instability were constant threats, and women especially were vulnerable to their devastating effects. In this unpredictable landscape, the sturdy walls of a convent often offered a sanctuary, a haven of relative peace and security that was difficult to find elsewhere. For many, the choice to become a nun was less about a divine calling and more a pragmatic decision for survival and protection. Physical safety was a primary concern. Castles and fortified towns offered some protection, but the countryside was frequently ravaged by conflict. Armies, both foreign invaders and local lords' forces, plundered villages, destroyed crops, and committed acts of violence against the populace. For women, this violence often included abduction, rape, and forced marriages. Convents, however, were often built with defensive walls, much like castles, and were regarded as neutral territory, protected by ecclesiastical law and sometimes by the patronage of powerful nobles or royalty. While not entirely immune to attack, they were generally safer than open villages or isolated manor houses. During periods of war or civil unrest, women, sometimes accompanied by their families, would seek refuge within the convent walls, staying until the immediate danger passed. For those who then chose to remain, the convent offered a permanent escape from the constant threat of violence. Beyond military threats, the medieval world presented numerous other dangers. Disease, particularly epidemics like the Black Death, swept through populations with terrifying speed and ferocity. Famine was a recurring specter, caused by bad harvests, war, or disrupted trade routes. In such times, convents, often possessing their own lands and food supplies and managing their resources meticulously, were typically better equipped to weather these crises than the general populace. They maintained their own infirmaries and often had knowledge of herbal medicine. While not immune to illness, the communal structure and relative stability offered a better chance of survival. Political instability also posed a significant threat, especially to noble families. When a lord lost favor with his king, or when a family was on the losing side of a dynastic struggle, their property could be confiscated, their lands seized, and their family members persecuted or exiled. For daughters caught in such unfortunate circumstances, a convent could provide a discreet and honorable hiding place. Entering a monastic order allowed them to disappear from the secular political stage, often preserving their lives and, in some cases, some residual family honor or property through the convent's protected status. It was a way to escape a vengeful monarch or a powerful enemy without being publicly disgraced or physically harmed. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and intriguing women of the medieval era. After her annulment from King Louis VII of France and subsequent marriage to Henry II of England, her life was one of constant political maneuvering and occasional imprisonment. Her mother, Honor de Châtellerault, had retreated to the Abbey of Fontfroid as a nun, a respectable way to step back from the world. Though Eleanor herself never took vows, the option of the convent for women like her, who had faced immense secular pressures and turmoil, was always a potential haven, a place of peace, but contemplation away from the endless political battles and personal dangers of royal life. For other less famous women, this option was not just a retreat, but a vital sanctuary. Widows too often sought the security of the convent. A widow, especially a wealthy one, was a vulnerable target. She might be pressured into a quick, disadvantageous remarriage to consolidate power or wealth, or her property might be coveted by male relatives. Entering a convent allowed her to retain her independence and protect her assets, dedicating them to the convent rather than losing them to a new husband or grasping family members. She could live out her days in peace, free from the societal pressures and predatory intentions that often targeted unattached women of means. The emotional and psychological security offered by the convent was also significant. Life in medieval society was often harsh and unforgiving. Personal tragedies, such as the death of a husband or children, or betrayal and social disgrace, could leave a woman isolated and vulnerable. The convent offered a structured, supportive community where she could find solace, purpose, and a sense of belonging. The communal life, the shared prayers, and the daily routines provided a sense of order and stability that could be deeply comforting to those who had experienced trauma or instability in the outside world. It was a place where women could find peace, mourn, and rebuild their lives away from the judgments and demands of secular society. In an age marked by uncertainty and peril, the convent stood as a bulwark against the chaos. It was a refuge where women could find physical protection, economic stability, and emotional solace, escaping the dangers and demands of a world that often offered them little control over their own destinies. For many, the cloister was not a confinement, but a liberation into safety and peace. Number 2. Education and intellectual pursuits. For women living in medieval Europe, opportunities for formal education were exceedingly rare outside the walls of a convent. They women, regardless of their social standing, were generally taught skills deemed appropriate for their station, managing a household, overseeing servants, perhaps some basic literacy for reading religious texts, or managing simple accounts if they were of the nobility or merchant class. But access to classical texts, philosophical debates, theological studies, or the chance to pursue intellectual endeavors for their own sake was almost exclusively limited to male institutions, primarily monasteries and universities, which were closed to women. Convent, however, often functioned as a vital, if not the only, center of learning for women, allowing them to engage in rigorous intellectual pursuits and contribute to scholarly and artistic life in ways otherwise impossible. Many convents maintained extensive libraries filled with rare manuscripts, theological treatises, classical literature, and scientific texts. Nuns had the precious privilege of learning to read and write Latin, the universal language of scholarship, theology, and diplomacy. This was not a minor detail. Literacy in Latin opened up an entire world of knowledge. It allowed nuns to delve into the writings of church fathers, pagan philosophers, and contemporary thinkers, fostering a deep engagement with the intellectual currents of their time. They were not merely passive recipients of knowledge. Many convents also housed scriptoria, where nuns actively copied, illuminated, and sometimes even translated manuscripts, contributing directly to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. The convent of Helfta in Saxony, for example, flourished during the 13th century as a vibrant intellectual and spiritual hub, became renowned for its mystical theology and the profound writings produced by its nuns. Mechthild of Magdeburg, Gertrude the Great, and Mechthild of Hackeborn were all associated with Helfta, producing sophisticated spiritual treatises, poetic works, and theological insights that deeply influenced later Christian thought. These women were highly educated, steeped in scripture, patristic writings, and contemporary mystical traditions. Their ability to write, to engage with complex ideas, and to articulate their spiritual experiences was entirely dependent on the intellectual environment fostered within their monastic community. Without the convent, their voices and their intellectual contributions might have been lost to history, or never even developed. Another remarkable example is Hratzvitha of Gandersheim, a canoness at the Imperial Abbey of Gandersheim in the 10th century, which we mentioned earlier for its political power. Hratzvitha was not just a chronicler. She was a playwright, writing 6 Latin comedies inspired by Terence, but reimagined with Christian themes. She also penned epic poems and historical narratives. Her works demonstrate a profound knowledge of classical literature, a keen intellect, and an exceptional ability to engage with complex moral and theological questions. Her literary output was a direct result of the educational opportunities available to her within the cloister, a place where women were encouraged to read, write, and think critically. Convents also served as schools for girls, both those destined for the monastic life and those who would return to the secular world. Noble and wealthy families often sent their daughters to convents for education, recognizing the superior instruction available there compared to what they could receive at home. These schools taught not only religious doctrine but also literacy, Latin, music, needlework, and sometimes even basic administrative skills. While some of these girls eventually took vows, others benefited from the convent's educational environment before returning to their families, equipped with knowledge and skills that enhanced their prospects in the lay world. The intellectual life of the convent extended beyond formal study. Nuns engaged in debates, discussions, and the exchange of ideas. They wrote letters, composed hymns and musical pieces, and created intricate illuminated manuscripts and liturgical vestments. These activities not only demonstrated their artistic and intellectual capabilities, but also reinforced the convent as a center of culture and creativity. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer, philosopher, mystic, and polymath, serves as a towering example of the intellectual and creative flourishing possible within the monastic setting. Her extensive writings encompassed theology, natural history, medicine, and music, and her visionary experiences were meticulously documented. While her spiritual gifts were profound, the structure of monastic life and the resources of her convent provided the necessary foundation for her immense intellectual and artistic output. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings. Her intellectual authority respected across Europe, a testament to the power and reach of a woman who harnessed the opportunities of the cloister. For women who possessed an innate curiosity, a thirst for knowledge, or a creative spirit, the convent offered a unique pathway. It was a place where their intellectual talents could be nurtured, where they had access to books and scholarly resources, and where they were often encouraged to develop their minds. In a world where intellectual pursuits were largely a male domain, the convent provided a vital and sometimes the only space for women to become scholars, writers, artists, and thinkers, contributing significantly to the intellectual and cultural heritage of the medieval period. This was a powerful magnet for women who craved more than domestic life, providing them with a life of purpose and intellectual fulfillment. Number 1. Social status and family strategy. In the intricate tapestry of medieval society, a family's standing was everything. It dictated their power, their alliances, and their future generations. While marriage was the primary tool for cementing alliances and passing on wealth, placing daughters in convents was another sophisticated and highly effective strategy for noble and wealthy families to enhance their social status, manage their finances, and even wield political influence. This was not merely an act of piety, it was often a calculated move on the grand chessboard of medieval power dynamics. For aristocratic families, the number of eligible daughters could present a significant challenge. Providing a substantial dowry for every daughter was expensive, potentially fragmenting family lands and depleting liquid assets. Marrying off daughters to less prestigious families could diminish a family's standing. Sending a daughter to a convent, particularly a wealthy and influential one, offered an elegant solution. The dowry required for a convent entrance was often less than a marriage dowry, and it was a one-time payment that freed the family from future financial obligations for that daughter. More importantly, it established a lasting connection between the family and a powerful religious institution. The most prestigious convents, often those with royal or imperial patronage, were not merely spiritual centers. They were powerful economic and political entities. These imperial abbeys, such as Quedlinburg, Gandersheim, or Essen in the Holy Roman Empire, held immense landholdings, commanded their own vassals, and exercised judicial rights, sometimes even minting their own coins. The abbess of such an institution was a feudal lord, often on par with, or even superior to, male counts and bishops in terms of her temporal power. She swore fealty directly to the emperor, bypassing intermediate lords, and her voice carried significant weight in political councils. Placing a daughter in such an abbey was a direct investment in family prestige and influence. If she became abbess, she essentially became a powerful family proxy within the church hierarchy, able to intercede on behalf of her relatives, offer patronage, and secure connections. Daughters from the highest noble families, including those of kings and emperors, were frequently placed in these convents, not because they were necessarily the most pious, but because their lineage lent immense prestige to the institution, and in return their families gained a powerful ally. For instance, the abbesses of Quedlinburg were often from the Saxon, Ottonian dynasty or other leading aristocratic houses, securing their position through both spiritual and temporal authority. This was a strategic deployment of family assets, a daughter being leveraged to preserve or enhance dynastic power. This strategy was not limited to the highest nobility. Wealthy merchant families, eager to climb the social ladder, also used convents as a means of legitimizing their status. By placing a daughter in a convent, especially one associated with old aristocratic families. They signaled their piety, their wealth, and their aspiration for social acceptance. Such an arrangement could help secure valuable social connections and sometimes even marriage alliances for other daughters, as it indicated a family's respectability and growing influence. The convent offered a pathway to social mobility, albeit a subtle one, for those outside the traditional aristocracy. Moreover, placing a daughter in a convent could serve as a solution for specific family dilemmas. If a daughter was deemed difficult or unsuitable for marriage, due to temperament, appearance, or physical disability, the convent offered a dignified placement, prevented her from becoming a social embarrassment or a drain on family resources, ensuring she was cared for and respectable without the need for a costly or impossible marriage. Similarly, if a family faced a crisis, a political fall from grace, financial ruin, or a devastating war, a daughter placed in a convent could be a strategic asset, preserving a link to the family's past status or offering a secure haven for a portion of the family's wealth or intellectual legacy. The dedication of a child to God from an early age was also a practice sometimes driven by genuine piety, but often intertwined with family strategy. A child could be offered to a monastery or convent as an oblate, to be raised within the monastic community, and eventually take vows. This practice, while less common in the later Middle Ages, cemented a long-term bond between the family and the institution, providing mutual benefits and enhancing the family's reputation for piety and influence. In essence, the convent provided a respectable and powerful avenue for daughters who were not destined for or desirable in a political marriage. It was a sophisticated alternative to dowries and alliances, allowing families to consolidate their wealth, preserve their lands, and extend their influence through the spiritual and temporal power of the Church. For many medieval families, placing a daughter in a convent was not an act of last resort, but a strategic move that served their dynastic ambitions and cemented their place in the rigid social hierarchy of the age.